Now we're going to talk some more about subject. When you're developing the subject for your screenplay and the style or the genre that you're working on, make sure you take the advice of that classic phrase, write what you know. Now, this might be that you need to write about a small town or an urban drama or just something that's close to you that you're familiar with. Because if you start writing about something that either you're not that familiar with or that you can't pull off with your budget, then you start to tell on yourself. You're broadcasting to your audience, either I'm new to this or I didn't really have a lot of money to do this well. So if you stick to something that you know and that you have access to, then the product is going to be that much better. You don't want to try to create this really complicated story of espionage and spies and things like that if you're not familiar with that world. Those things, often I see, especially college students or film school students, they go to make their first short and they want lots of guns and action scenes and shooting, but they don't have the actors or the budget or the familiarity with the subject to really pull it off. And then it just looks kind of clunky and amateur. Now, if you want to tell a story that is more about, a goofy spy and you don't know what you're talking about and it's like the worst spy ever, then you might be able to leverage that low budget into telling that story in a good way. The first feature film I ever worked on was a mockumentary called Hitting the Nuts. And it was surrounding this small town in Indiana. And each year they had an annual illegal underground poker tournament. But because it was in a small town and because it was secretly executed, then you had permission that the tournament could feel a little goofy and clunky and not like the World Series of Poker in Vegas. It was part of the story that the characters didn't have a lot of money, they didn't have a lot of experience, but they were trying to pull off this big thing. And so it played hand in hand and enhanced the story rather than taking away from it. So that's what you got to think about is, what do you know, what do you have access to that is going to make the story better, that you know well, rather than trying to pull off something that you're not that familiar with and that's going to tell on you and disengage with your audience. And when you're thinking about that subject matter, you can also think about what's the super niche that you can go after that will draw an audience, that maybe an underserved audience that would love to see more movies, more entertainment related to a subject matter that they're passionate about. This might be something related to minor league hockey or professional indoor lacrosse or that sort of niche, or maybe it's something like Messianic Jews or something of that nature, where maybe it's an underserved market, and if you create this story and you tell this story well, then you're going to have an audience built in with the subject matter. That's starting to get into a little bit of, as you're writing and developing this feature film, you also have to keep in mind the marketing, the distribution, and the sales component of making the feature film. Over the years of making feature films, we started to learn this lesson on the marketing and distribution side, that your budget has to equal your coalition, or hopefully your budget is even a little bit smaller than the size of your coalition. And you might be thinking about what do you mean budget and coalition? How do those two things equate? And if you have a small budget, you need to consider a small, passionate audience. If you just make something for yourself, that might be great, but there's not going to necessarily be an audience for it and an audience to support it. But if you're making your film for, let's say, $2,000, if you're making your film for $2,000, then can you find a coalition that will be bigger than $2,000, that that there will be more than enough people to watch this film that will then help you sell the movie, make enough sales, whether it be enough plays on streaming or enough digital downloads that can support that $2,000 budget. The good news is, if your budget's low, like $2,000, the audience doesn't have to be that big. So like we were talking about, you could go after a super niche that's underserved and then have a really good shot. Now, if you can somehow leverage licensing Star Wars or having Brad Pitt in your movie, then all of a sudden it supports a bigger budget, because that's a bigger coalition. People who love Brad Pitt and want to see Brad Pitt movies, or people who love Star Wars and want to see Star Wars movies, that audience is really huge. So therefore, you can justify the larger budget. But with your budget, it might need to be a lot smaller, but a deep coalition that you can tap into. If this is religious content, then you could think about pro-life evangelical Christians, and you're going to tap into that audience and something that they're passionate about and get their support. Or it might be fans of professional curling, and so it might be a small audience but passionate, and you can go after that audience, and it's going to be easier to target them in marketing and distribution efforts. But as you're developing that subject, you need to be thinking about that as well. What niche is this subject going to tap into? As you're developing the content for your screenplay, you're also going to want to think about avoiding copyright and logos. This is another, let's call it a fun parameter challenge, or an opportunity to push yourself creatively. You're not going to want to reference really popular brands or corporations in your material. That's going to affect your marketing and distribution and your E&O insurance, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But just avoid referencing those, and think about what you might be writing into your screenplay that would need to be visually referenced in the feature film. That you don't want to have to show logos of big companies. When you're shooting that, you're going to want to block those out, remove those, cover them up. It's called Greeking it out. You want to Greek it out. You'll want to create your own custom brands, own custom music. Don't reference a popular book or think that you could put a really popular pop song into your screenplay. That's going to be really expensive. Take a lot of time and money to navigate that. So as you're writing the screenplay, avoid that urge to reference an established big brand, and instead make it to your advantage. Come up with something custom that can be included in that. And that will avoid some trouble with your E&O insurance. That stands for errors and omissions insurance. A lot of distributors, if and when your feature film gets picked up by a distributor, a lot of them will require you to have E&O insurance. And what that means is there's an insurance policy that you have to purchase, and that's to cover you in case another entity, a big corporation or identity, comes after you and says, our brand was represented poorly, or we don't like how our brand was represented in your film, and then you get into a legal battle. The E&O insurance will cover you on that. And when you're applying for that, though, if they see references to the big brands in your film, they're going to say either we're not going to grant you this policy, or the policy is going to be that much more expensive, or they're going to ask you to go back and edit it out. So get ahead of that and just don't write it in to begin with, and you can avoid that pain with the E&O insurance and help your movie receive distribution in that way. So when you're thinking about the subject of your screenplay for your feature film, you're going to want to think about those three topics that we've been talking about: is what do I like, what do I know, and what do I have access to? You're thinking about the friends and family in your network, any favors that you are owed, any unique things that you have access to. Where does that Venn diagram come together of what do I like, what do I know, and what do I have access to? And that's going to inform and drive the subject for your feature film.